Now on to the other one that says there should be a title to be announced. And that title to be announced is, Where's Waldo? Some of you may be familiar with the Where's Waldo books by Martin Handford. It's a whole series of books, British author. All of them have pages of carefully and intricately drawn characters that are jumbled all over across the pages. It's basically a picture book is what it is. And on every page, there's this little character in a red and white suit and a bobble hat, and you're supposed to be looking for that person. And the suit is what helps you identify where that person is on the page. But every now and then there are some red herrings of other things that have red on them. To throw a little bit of loop and make it a little more difficult to find them. Well, I want you to get this image of looking for Where's Waldo as we begin, and just kind of bracket it off because we're going back to it again at some point. I want to begin the sermon though by telling a story that was first told by Bishop William. He tells that one Sunday after church we stopped at a restaurant. It was crowded and our server looked tired and weary. After the meal and things were thinning out, he says, I asked her, you look tired, are you okay? She told me she'd been up most of the night with her little boy who was sick, but that she was okay. I said, it must be hard after being up all night, having to stand on your feet and work so hard. She merely nodded. What's the hardest day of the week to work? He asked. She didn't know that he was a reverend, but she said, the hardest day of the week to work is Sunday. I dread all those people who come here after church. They make so many demands, and many of them sound so hateful, and, you know, they hardly ever tip anything. William tells that story in the context of a discussion that we might be having here on this particular Sunday morning. The question under discussion is, where is, not Waldo, but where is Jesus? It's the reign of Christ, or Christ the King Sunday in the liturgical calendar. It is the last Sunday in the church year. Next Sunday begins the new church year with Advent, and then almost always falls, as it does this year, on Thanksgiving weekend. So as we prepare to gather as families to consume the large bird and all of the accoutrements with it as the week goes on, we come together to ask ourselves today, where is Jesus? Where in the world do we find the one in whose name we come together on Sunday? Many, especially more evangelical brothers and sisters, will tell you that Jesus is in our hearts. Some, especially Roman Catholics, will wear or display crucifixes to which an image of Jesus is attached. United Methodists, along with many other denominations, will tell you that Jesus is present in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist that we share together at certain times in our worship. There are many others who would start by telling you that Jesus is in the pages of a black leather-covered book that their preachers wave around oftentimes as they preach. Now, in some sense, all of these answers bear a bit of the truth. Jesus is indeed found in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. Jesus is in the Bible. Jesus is found in the hearts of those who claim to be Christian. But I would agree with Bishop Williman when he says that none of those places is Jesus' primary residence. So where would you look to find Jesus' primary residence? Where is the place that Jesus is most evidently found today? Pastor, author, and spiritual advisor to President Clinton, among others, Tony Campola, tells a true story of a Jewish boy who suffered under the Nazis in World War II. A story that might begin to find the answer to our question of where is Jesus' primary residence. The boy in Campola's story was living in a small Polish village when he and all of the other Jews in the village were rounded up and sentenced to death. This boy and the others in the village began to dig their own graves, and then they faced the firing squad. And sprayed with machine gun fire, he fell into the trench with all of the others. The Nazis afterwards covered the crumbled bodies with dirt. But none of the bullets hit this little boy. Splattered with blood, after dark fell, he clawed his way out of the ditch, and he began to walk back to where there was civilization. And he knocked on a door and begged for help. Recognizing him as one of the little Jewish kids, people who would otherwise have helped were afraid and chose not to help. They were afraid they'd get into trouble with the troops if they found him. Then something inside this boy led him to do something that you would not expect a Jewish person very likely to say. When he went to the next family who responded to his timid knocking in the still of the night, they heard this little boy say, "Don't you recognize me? I am the Jesus that you say you love." Well, after a poignant pause, the woman who answered the door grabbed the little boy up in her arms and took him in the house. And this family raised this little boy as if he were their own. Look at today's reading from Matthew's Gospel. "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Jesus is the one who is at the margins of society. Jesus is the one who is waiting tables to support the sick boy at home. Jesus is living on the streets. Jesus stands in the soup kitchen line. Jesus is waiting at the Salvation Army for someone to give him a warm coat. Jesus is in the hospital suffering from AIDS or more recently from Ebola. Jesus is the one who is hoping that someone will come and care for him or her. Jesus is the one who is unable to even go to the hospital because they cannot afford it. Jesus is the one who is in prison. Now don't blame me. You have to blame Jesus for saying it. At least that's what it says in the book. There is no way that we can misread what the gospel says. Most certainly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these in my family, you have done it for me. In other words, wherever people are hurting, wherever people suffer, wherever people do without their basic needs, Jesus is right there. And he's not just there to comfort them. Jesus is there on their side of the fence, suffering along with them. That's where Jesus is. Now don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that Jesus is absent from all of the nice and warm church places where people gather each week to worship and to seek inspiration and insight for them to go back into the world and to do the work of Jesus and to be Jesus for other people. I'm not saying that Jesus is disinterested in the joys and concerns that we share as we prepare for our morning prayer from week to week. Or that Jesus is not in some real sense present in the reading and the preaching from the Word. That Jesus is not present in the sharing the bread and the cup from week to week. I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm only saying that whether it is inside the church or outside the church, Jesus is at the place of the margins, where there is the most chaos, where there is the most brokenness, and where there is the greatest need. A well-known story is told of St. Francis of Assisi. saint from whom our current Pope Francis takes his name. Francis of Assisi was born into a noble family in Italy in the 12th century. He was one of those that you would call a poor little rich boy who had everything. He was a musician and a party boy. He lived for music and poetry and party and for women, not necessarily in that order. Legend has it that in one of his times away from home where he escaped the eyes and the ears of his parents, he was riding back home toward Assisi when suddenly he saw a leper next to the road. Although the lepers in that day were just as much feared as they were in Jesus' day and just as loathed as they were at that time, for some reason Francis dismounted and gave this leper all of the money that he happened to have left in his pocket. And then extraordinarily, for some reason he went farther. He took the man's hand and kissed it. And as he kissed the man, Francis felt at peace for the first time. Then he hugged the man, previously considered to be untouchable, and he gave him the kiss of peace on the cheek, and then he received the kiss of peace from this man as he returned it. He then got back on his horse and began to ride away back to Assisi. And he turned around and suddenly realized that there was nobody there. And that indeed it had been Jesus who was the leper at the side of the road. Although he had been struggling for a long time with the feeling that Jesus was trying to speak with him, it took the presence of this leper on the side of the road to finally bring him face to face with Jesus in a way that made a difference. Stories like that did not end in St. Francis' time. They continue today. As I said earlier, just this past week, among those whose lives have been lost in the West African Ebola outbreak, one has been Dr. Martin Salia, working at the United Methodist Kizzy Hospital outside of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Though a permanent resident of the United States, his wife living in Maryland, Dr. Salia felt a strong call to work in the country of his birth. I knew it wasn't going to be rosy, he said, but why did I decide to choose this job? I firmly believe that God wanted me to do it. And I knew deep within myself there was just something inside me that said that the people of Freetown needed help. I am confident that God sent me here, and that's my passion. And so we are grateful to people like Dr. Salia who offer themselves, offer their lives at risk of their very lives, and who find Jesus in the face of the needy and model for us that kind of looking for Christ. Just this last Sunday, Jeanette and I worshiped at Grace United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas. It is described as a church, quote, in a changing neighborhood. You all probably understand that. Among its ministries are a multilingual daycare, a medical clinic, a legal aid clinic, and others that reach out to the community. We worship there because of its storied architecture, its beautiful stained glass windows, its reputation for outreach and mission, and for its being a reconciling congregation. Well, we got there early to kind of adjust ourselves to the building, admired the stained glass windows in the building, and suddenly a door opened and a familiar face unexpectedly appeared. A woman that was an acquaintance of ours came to worship that Sunday as well. She was Lorenza Andrade Smith, who is an ordained United Methodist pastor whose appointment is to be with people in the streets. She travels all across the United States and all around the world, actually, being with people and caring for them that live in the streets. Well, we greeted her, and it didn't take her very long, and she made a friend of a street person. And before too long, she and her friend came and asked whether they could sit with us. Sure. And they did. And just before the service began, a young boy in their youth group came by and was selling some candy bars as a fundraiser. Well, the homeless man turned to me and asked whether he could have $1 to buy one of the candy bars. Now, I'm here to tell you that if I had met him out on the street, chances are I wouldn't have given him that $1. But he was there, and the candy bars were being sold, and I gave him $1, and he got up, and by now the kid had gone around the front, and he walked up there and got his candy bar, and he sat down, and he ate that candy bar with such relish. So, on that particular Sunday, Lorenza Smith's ministry caught me up in the work that she does in some small way. Inasmuch as you do it for one of the least of these. Yes, indeed, the stories do continue. And finding Jesus trumps the fun of finding Waldo. And when Jesus comes, in the story that we just heard read, it is almost always a surprise. Pray and listen.